decorrer da luta, pode ficar mais perigoso.
He wasn't just fighting to win. Wanderlei Silva was fighting to hurt people. That was the difference. In the early 2000s, inside the cold silence of the Saitama Super Arena, when the lights dropped and the crowd faded into a low hum, there was a moment fighters feared more than anything. Not the bell, not the referee, but the walk. Because when Wanderlei stepped forward, head low, eyes locked, it didn't look like competition. It looked like something far more dangerous. This was pride. No safety net, no soft rules. Soccer kicks landed without hesitation. Knees crashed into grounded opponents. Fighters walked into the ring already injured, already exhausted, already carrying damage from the last war. And in that environment, Wanderlei wasn't just surviving, he was hunting. But there's something people don't talk about. Not every fight ended with respect. Not every rivalry stayed inside the ring. Some names stayed with him long after the crowd went home. Some losses weren't just defeats. They were humiliation. Some opponents didn't just beat him. They took something from him. And those are the men he never truly forgave. Before we begin the story, we need to understand who Wanderlei Silva truly was. Wanderlei Silva was born in 1976 in Curitiba, Brazil. Long before the lights of pride, long before the violence became spectacle, he was just another fighter coming out of a country where fighting was not a career, it was survival. He came up through Vale Tudo. No gloves worth mentioning, no rounds that gave you time to recover, just raw, unforgiving combat where mistakes were punished immediately. That's where his style was forged. Not in gyms designed for comfort, but in environments where fear was real and hesitation got you hurt. By the time he entered Pride, he wasn't learning how to fight anymore. He had already become something else. Aggressive, relentless, built on forward pressure and damage. He didn't wait. He didn't calculate like others. He walked forward and forced you into chaos. At his peak, he became the face of Pride's brutality, Pride middleweight champion, winner of the 2003 Grand Prix, the kind of fighter who didn't just beat opponents, but overwhelmed them. Names like Kazushi Sakuraba and Quinton Jackson weren't just victories, they were statements. But behind that dominance, there was a cost. The training camps were brutal. The injuries never fully healed. Fights came too often, too close together. And every time he stepped into the ring, he carried damage from the last war. There was no reset, no clean slate, and over time, that kind of life changes a fighter. The violence that made him famous also changed him forever. Number 5, Vitor Belfort. Long before Pride, before the walkouts, before the aura, there was a night that never really left Wanderlei Silva. October 1998, UFC Brazil. A different era, a different stage, but the same truth. Wanderlei was still building himself, still trying to prove he belonged among the dangerous men. Across from him stood Vitor Belfort, faster, sharper, already known for his explosive hands. The fight didn't unfold slowly. It didn't give time to adjust. Belfort came forward with speed that Wanderlei hadn't fully experienced yet. Punches landed clean. Not one shot, not two. A burst. And just like that, it was over. A first-round TKO. Fast, violent, one-sided. That loss mattered more than most people understand. Because it didn't just expose a weakness. It introduced something Wanderlei rarely showed later in his career. Hesitation. Just for a moment. But it was there. And in a world where his entire identity would later be built on walking forward without fear, that moment stayed buried underneath everything he became. Years later, when Wanderlei was destroying opponents in Pride, overwhelming fighters with pressure, knees, and brutality, that version of him looked unstoppable, like a man who had never doubted himself. But that wasn't true. The memory of Belfort was still there. Not just the loss, but how it happened, how quickly control disappeared, how powerless he felt once the momentum shifted. There was no chance to recover, no second phase, just damage. And in old-school MMA, that kind of defeat wasn't just technical, it was psychological. Fighters didn't talk about it. They didn't analyze it on broadcasts. But inside gyms, inside camps, Moments like that shaped everything. They changed how you approached exchanges, how you reacted under pressure, how much you trusted your own instincts when chaos started. For Wanderlei, that fight became something else. It became a reminder that aggression alone wasn't enough, that someone faster, more precise, could take everything away before you even had time to impose your will. And more importantly, it became the first name attached to a feeling he would never fully accept: loss of control. He didn't carry it publicly, he didn't speak about it often, but the way he fought afterward, the way he closed distance, the way he refused to give opponents space, it all pointed back to that night. Because once you've been finished that quickly, once you felt that kind of helplessness, you don't forget it. And sometimes you don't forgive it either. Number 4, Mark Hunt. By 2004, Wanderlei Silva was no longer the young fighter searching for identity. He was the champion, the face of pride, the man who walked forward and made other fighters break. And that was exactly why the fight against Mark Hunt felt different from the start. Hunt wasn't supposed to fit into Wanderlei's world. He came from K1, a pure striker. Heavy hands, yes, but slower, less dynamic. On paper, this was supposed to be controlled violence, the kind of fight where Wanderlei dictates pace, closes distance, and overwhelms. But the moment the fight began, something shifted. Hunt didn't react the way others did. He didn't back up. He didn't freeze under pressure. He stood there, calm, absorbing, waiting. And for the first time in a long time, Wanderlei couldn't impose fear. The exchanges were different. Wanderlei still moved forward, still threw combinations, still tried to break rhythm. But Hunt absorbed the damage in a way that disrupted everything. Shots that normally pushed opponents backward barely changed his position. Knees landed, but they didn't create panic. The usual reaction just wasn't there. And that changes a fight more than people realize. Because Wanderlei's style wasn't just about striking. It was about reaction, about forcing the opponent into survival mode. Once that happens, the fight becomes predictable. But against Hunt, that moment never came. Instead, it became a different kind of battle. One where physical strength started to matter more than intimidation. One where durability canceled out aggression. There were moments where Wanderlei landed clean. Moments where, in other fights, the opponent would have folded. But Hunt didn't. He stayed there, present, dangerous. And every second that passed, the control Wanderlei was used to having started to slip. This wasn't a knockout loss. It wasn't a sudden finish like Belfort. It was something more uncomfortable. A realization that there were fighters who simply could not be broken the way he broke others. And in old school MMA, that creates a different kind of tension. Because when intimidation fails, when pressure doesn't create openings, the fight becomes unpredictable. It becomes physical. It becomes risky in ways Wanderlei didn't prefer. After the fight, the result didn't define the story. The feeling did. Because for a man whose entire identity was built on dominance, on making others react, standing across from someone who refused to give that reaction creates something close to frustration, even anger. Not loud, not public, but internal. Hunt didn't humiliate him the way others did, but he exposed something Wanderlei didn't like facing, that not every opponent could be controlled. And sometimes that's enough to stay with you. Number 3, Ricardo Arona. In 2005, inside the Pride Middleweight Grand Prix, Wanderlei Silva walked in as the champion. Not just a title holder, but the center of the division, the man everything revolved around. Across from him stood Ricardo Arona. On paper, it was a classic clash. Striker versus grappler, pressure versus control, violence versus patience. And in Pride, that kind of matchup usually favored Wanderlei, because most grapplers couldn't survive the chaos long enough to impose their game. But Arona wasn't most grapplers. From the opening moments, the tone felt wrong. Wanderlei tried to establish pressure, closing distance, the way he always did. Hands high, moving forward, forcing exchanges. But Arona didn't engage in that space. He waited, calculated. And when the opening came, he didn't strike. He closed distance differently. The takedown changed everything. Once on the ground, the fight slowed to a pace Wanderlei hated. Not slow because nothing was happening, but slow because control replaced chaos. Arona didn't rush. He didn't try to finish recklessly. He held position, adjusted weight, removed space inch by inch, and Wanderlei couldn't explode out of it. That's where the frustration started, because this wasn't about damage. It was about control. Every time Wanderlei tried to create movement, Arona shut it down. Every attempt to stand, every shift of the hips, every small opening was met with pressure in the opposite direction. It was methodical, cold, and more importantly, it was effective. Round after round, the pattern stayed the same. Wanderlei, the most aggressive force in Pride, was being forced to react. Not attack, react. That's a position he rarely found himself in. There were moments where he tried to bring the fight back to his world. Short bursts, small windows where he created space. But they never lasted. Arona always pulled it back into control. By the end, the result was clear. A decision loss. But the result wasn't the part that stayed with Wanderlei. It was the feeling of being neutralized. In Pride, fighters expected damage. They expected pain. But being controlled like that, being unable to impose your identity, that creates a different kind of reaction. It's not physical, it's internal. Because for a fighter like Wanderlei, fighting wasn't just about winning rounds. It was about dominance, about breaking the opponent's will. And Arona didn't break. He didn't even bend. He simply took control and held it. That kind of loss doesn't create loud anger. It creates something quieter, something that sits deeper. Because there's no moment to point to. No single strike, no dramatic finish. Just a long, uncomfortable realization that someone found a way to shut you down completely. And for Wanderlei, that may have been harder to accept than any knockout. Number 2, Dan Henderson. September 2007, Pride 33. The final chapter of an era that had already begun to collapse behind the scenes. But inside the ring, none of that mattered yet. This was champion versus champion. Wanderlei Silva, the longtime king of the middleweight division, against Dan Henderson, the man who carried titles in 2 weight classes. It wasn't just a fight. It was a statement about who truly controlled the division before Pride disappeared. From the start, the tension was different. Henderson wasn't intimidated. He didn't react to Wanderlei's forward pressure the way others did. He moved with purpose, compact, efficient, wrestling base underneath everything. He wasn't there to survive. He was there to take something. The first round didn't explode into chaos. It built slowly. Wanderlei tried to establish rhythm, pushing forward, throwing combinations, looking to create the kind of exchanges that defined his career. But Henderson stayed disciplined. He didn't overcommit. He waited. And then it happened. A single right hand. Not flashy, not complicated, just perfectly timed. It landed clean. Wanderlei dropped face first to the canvas. No second phase, no scramble, no recovery, just silence. In a career built on walking forward, on absorbing damage and continuing, that moment broke the pattern completely. There was no chance to fight through it, no opportunity to show resilience. The fight ended instantly. Knockout. And with it, the belt was gone. But what made this different wasn't just the loss. It was how final it felt. Against Belfort, there was youth. Against Arona, there was control. Against Hunt, there was resistance. But this was collapse. Because it happened at the peak. When Wanderlei was supposed to be untouchable. When his aura was still intact. When opponents were still expected to break under pressure. Instead, he was the one who fell. And in old-school MMA, especially in Pride, aura mattered. It wasn't just marketing, it was psychological. Fighters walked into the ring already affected by what they believed about their opponent. That night, something changed. The image of Wanderlei Silva, the unstoppable force, cracked. And once that image breaks, it doesn't fully come back. Henderson didn't just win the fight, he took the belt. He took the momentum, and more importantly, he took a piece of Wanderlei's identity. That's the kind of loss that doesn't fade. It stays attached to a name, and for Wanderlei, Dan Henderson became more than an opponent. He became a moment that defined the beginning of the end. Number 1, Quinton Jackson. There are losses, and then there are reversals. For years, Wanderlei Silva owned this rivalry. Pride 25, 2003. Wanderlei destroyed Jackson with knees in the clinch. Violent, relentless. The kind of finish that didn't just end a fight, but left an image burned into people's memory. Then again in Pride Final Conflict 2004, it wasn't just a win, it was domination. Jackson was the one absorbing punishment. Jackson was the one breaking under pressure. In that era, the story was clear. Wanderlei was the predator. Jackson was the one who couldn't survive him. And in Pride, narratives like that mattered. They followed fighters. They defined how future fights were approached. They shaped confidence, identity, even fear. But when both men arrived in the UFC, the environment had changed. Different cage, different rules, no soccer kicks, no knees to grounded opponents. The chaos that Wanderlei thrived in had been reduced. The space was tighter, the rhythm was different. And in 2008, at UFC 92, the rivalry came back. But it wasn't the same fight anymore. From the opening seconds, there was tension. Not the wild aggression of Pride, but something more cautious, more calculated. Wanderlei still moved forward, still tried to bring pressure. But Jackson wasn't reacting the way he once did. He wasn't backing up blindly. He wasn't getting trapped. He was waiting. And when Wanderlei stepped in, when he committed to an exchange the way he always had, Jackson answered. A hook, clean, precise, perfect timing. Wanderlei went down. Not slowly, not in stages, just like that. Knockout. The man who had once broken Jackson twice was now the one lying on the canvas. And that changes everything. Because this wasn't just a loss, it was a reversal of identity. The entire narrative flipped in a single moment. The predator became the victim. The memory of dominance was replaced by a new image, a final image. And in fighting, the last image is often the one that stays. There was no third act in Pride to balance it, no return to the old rules, no chance to reclaim the version of himself that had controlled this rivalry. This was the UFC now, a different system, a different reality. And Jackson adapted better. For Wanderlei, that moment carried more than just defeat. It carried something personal, because he knew who he had been against Jackson before. He knew what those fights looked like. He knew the version of himself that had once controlled every second of that matchup. And now, that version was gone. Jackson didn't just win. He rewrote the rivalry. And when a man takes your past, your dominance, your identity, and turns it against you in front of the world, that doesn't fade with time. That becomes something else. Not just a loss, but the name you never truly forget. The crowd remembered the violence. They remembered the nights when Wanderlei Silva walked forward and made other men break. The knockouts, the knees, the feeling that once he stepped into the ring, something irreversible was about to happen. But they didn't remember what came after. Because fights like those don't end when the bell rings. They stay with you, in the body, in the mind. In the moments when the arena goes quiet and there's nothing left but damage and memory, those 5 names were never just opponents. They were moments where control slipped away, where identity cracked, where the version of Wanderlei Silva the world believed in didn't exist anymore, even if only for a few seconds. And in old school MMA, that's all it took. Pride wasn't built on perfection. It was built on survival. Fighters didn't leave untouched. They left changed. The belts faded, the highlights lived on, but the scars stayed. And maybe that's the part people never wanted to see.